Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of whether and how politics should appear in our preaching this week. My name is Raj Patta. I'm a Methodist minister working at the United Stockport Circuit in Manchester and Stockport district, but I originally come from the Andhra Evangelical Lutheran Church in India. Each week, I am joined by a guest from a different place and space on the pulpit and political landscape. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce my guest, who is Canon Peter Dobson. Peter has been a canon for Outreach and Discipleship at Newcastle Cathedral, and I'm delighted that he is with us this morning to share his thoughts.
Thanks,
Peter,
Raj.
a very warm welcome, Peter, to this our conversation on politics in the pulpit. I thank you very much for joining, but I'm also glad to see that your role as a canon at the Newcastle Cathedral is to make the sacred space common ground. So
Yes.
that's fascinating to read about. So can you tell a little bit more about yourself and whether or not you see yourself as a political pulpit practitioner preacher yourself?
Yeah, so I guess I'm one of those people that does see that and probably is of the opinion that all preaching ultimately is political, that it's about how we see ourselves in the light of our faith, in the network of our relationships in our communities. And, you know, I guess really that we all have far more influence than we maybe realize as disciples. And so therefore, I think all preaching is political. And I guess that for me, really, I'm always conscious that so much of my faith and who I am is grounded in the community in which, the Christian community in which I grew up, which was on a council estate here in Newcastle, where my parents had lived. We weren't living there by then, but I guess my faith was formed in a very small church in the heart of a community that was changing, and it was changing really because the idea of regeneration was to basically get rid of half of the housing, which was all social or council housing, and to try and improve the area by adding lots of owner-occupier housing. And what it meant really was the shifting of a community's life, which initially wasn't necessarily for the good, because it brought disintegration in it, ruined some relationships, and it wasn't what the community had wanted. But in the middle of all that really was this Christian community that previously and still then was pretty courageous, I always thought, and strong in relating to lots, some antisocial behaviour, some lots of social problems, but it was never judgmental. It was always gracious. It was always, well, of course we'll put the glass back in the windows because that it's the community's church, it's not ours if this is what's happening. And I guess that's where everything's gone from there, from being part of a Christian community that was at the heart of a changing community, which had lots of things that were challenges, and it was there, and I guess then my amazing experience to find out just how do we continue to relate in those circumstances. And I guess my ministry's had that, I hope, at the heart of it, ever since.
Super, Peter. I'm really thrilled as I read about you to know that you are a canon now working in a cathedral and trying to say how best can this sacred space can become a place of radical welcome. So what has been your experience? Because as a student of public theology, we always understand that our faith has that too with our church language and the community language. So how do you do public theology in your space?
Yes, and I think again, I'm one of those people that think our space is a great, well, it is a gift to us, and so we have to steward and care for that gift as best we can. Here at Newcastle, Newcastle Cathedral's pretty much, it's like almost on a roundabout, right in the middle of the city. There's no big green, there's no nice cloister. It's the life of the city and the life of the cathedral are bumping up against each other all the time, and our desire is that it's not bumping up against, it's blending with one another. So we've only just reopened. All through the pandemic, we were doing a huge piece of work, which was to reorder the space and make it more accessible, but also make it a place that's much more a public space, a public square. So we now have a clear floor, and already this space is being used in ways that we never were able to before. A big part of the way the space was being redeveloped was actually to retell some of the stories. So we have around 150 ledger stones, so monuments on the floor, which is a symbol to us that this has been Newcastle's. Before it was a cathedral, it was Newcastle's parish church, right at the heart of the city, as you can hear, and our work has been to really find a way to retell those stories, but also with the emphasis not just on the heritage, but about making sure that the cathedral is a place where the stories of the city and the people for whom this is our city are at the heart of what we do. So we're developing a piece of work around we have a very distinctive tower. It's a lantern shape, and there used to be a lantern burning in the tower, which used to be like a lighthouse for those coming up the Tyne in ships, and was a significant landmark. So we're developing something called the Lantern Initiative, which is really a piece of work around how the cathedral responds especially to vulnerability, because at the heart of the city, you'll imagine that actually we in a sense don't have to work very hard to do public theology. I don't think, if we think about public theology in the way I think we ought to think about it, in the sense that the meeting of people in the public square, and so we do have an awful lot of people who are a part of our community who come to us in a whole range of different vulnerability. And what we've been trying to do is actually one of our first value is radical welcome. How do we make sure that we welcome someone who is someone who comes in a tweed jacket and salmon chinos the same way that we welcome someone who's coming with their sleeping bag over their shoulder and having come. And so I think our public theology here is as simple as, begins at least, as simple as that. And I guess what we say about radical welcome is that this is a space for all people. One of the things, while we were having the work being done, that there was hoarding all around the cathedral, and one of the images I still have is of our screen as you go into the choir, which has the crucifix and those gathered around it at the cross. And it had this image, and on the side, making a space for all people. And I thought that was a great image, that here was the image of the cross inside the cathedral, and with the slogan that we are about making a space here for all people. And that our welcome is about what we say about radical welcome is, people say, what is radical welcome? Well, the Dean here would say, and it's become our shorthand, that radical welcome is welcoming people to the point where actually we're questioning and maybe uncomfortable, and then going further.
That's fascinating, Peter, and I really appreciate what you have been doing there. So I'm sure our listeners who are listening to this podcast can reflect on their own spaces, so-called sacred spaces, and how each of our sacred space can become that place of radical welcome. So thank you for those insights and for all that you've been doing there at Newcastle. So then, from your own context, what would you want us to hear as key justice political issues that are happening today?
Yeah, from our context, I think there are a number of things, and it comes really from comes out of that radical welcome, because I think that's about encounter. But we all know that our faith is not about simply encounters, but how encounters become relationships, and relationships build a community. So I guess the issues that come for us, I think, are really those which we, because of the relationships we're building here, are confronted with. And I think one of the things my colleague who does more of the work on the Lantern Initiative, I sort of have responsibility for it, but John, my colleague, who's wonderful, is doing some really great pieces of work about really around how certain groups still are pretty hidden in our society, whether that's those who have a background and experience in addiction and substance misuse, and that's one of the issues I think he and I are really passionate about. That actually, why when we do with other issues think about them as issues of health, why do we look at for instance drug use as something which is about we look at that through a criminal lens, not through a public health lens, and that's one of the big issues that we are trying to have a voice and trying to move the agenda on a bit, really. I would say the other for us is around homelessness, which is really where lots of the ideas for our Lantern Initiative thinking has come from. That I think that we want to seem to address homelessness in a very neat and tidy way, but we all know that homelessness isn't just simply that someone might not have a house. And for instance, spending a fair bit of time last week in the cathedral with a lady, who is not mentally well, who is being abused by her neighbour. She does have a house, but that is not a home. It's not where she and she falls through the cracks time and again because of her mental health, because of the fact she has a house. I would say one of the agenda things we're pushing here is that actually, in our context, in terms of housing, people can only be helped in the area where they're from. Well, actually, how do we honour the fact that some people are wanting to move on in life into a place that is new, that actually the place where they once were it is part of the problem. I think wider than that, we've just been putting together our Lent series, which will be on Radical Welcome. I think we're really struck, beyond our local context, but still here as well, around the issues that we're all I'm sure, very aware of in terms of the political landscape being so fractious that actually we seem to struggle. I think there are just issues around the way that we just seem not to be able to engage on the political spectrum from different parts anymore, and that actually that is bringing a greater disintegration generally in our common life, I think.
Yes, Peter, I think homelessness is a national issue, and as churches, as followers of Christ, we're all thinking how to address and situations of vulnerability, which are great, and we really wish you all the best with your work there at the cathedral. But every week, our colleagues at the Joint Public Issues team give us a little roundup about with their experience of what they might think that we want to be keeping an eye on the world this week. So some of their suggestions, as obviously you will know, there are still some ongoing discussions about the conduct by number 10, particularly in the wake of bullying and harassment allegations, accusations of blackmail by the party whips to get rebellious MPs on side, uh, of Islamophobia by Nusrat Ghani MP. Sue Gray's report on number 10's parties is expected to be released this week. I'm sure these could have major implications for the Prime Minister, but how might we imagine a different politics that is truthful, kind, and compassionate, which is one of the 6 hopes of the Joint Public Issues team? And they also continue to give us a context about the tensions in Ukraine as they're escalating, and the Nationality and Borders Bill that gets to committee stage in the House of the Lords on the 27th, the global context of Tonga with the impact of the volcanic eruption, where aid is still reaching these islands. And this week on the 27th of January is the Holocaust Memorial Day. So resources are there about it from the website of Council of Christians and Jews. And on Tuesday, February the 1st, we have 1 year anniversary of the coup in Myanmar and how the junta is destroying villages in their regions. So we have such a compact, intense politics that is happening across the world. So in such a context, now with our metaphorical use of saying we have newspapers on one hand, now we have the Bible on the other hand. So if we have to turn our Bibles now, so I wonder if there was any particular passage or a particular theme or a question that comes out for you from the readings for this week.
Yeah, and as you say, there's just such a huge amount to be thinking about, isn't there? But I think that theme I think that I came to think about, trying to connect my context with what else was going on in the world and with this week's texts, is actually around that word disintegration. But I think across this week's lectionary readings, there's this, in the prophecy of Jeremiah, it's beginning with understanding where we get our value. That actually, that there's something about, especially in his case, for a difficult task and sense of vocation, but actually understanding our value is so very important in terms of reducing disintegration, it seems to me, in the readings this week. Because I'm just really struck by, for instance, some of the stuff that's happening in our politics here in this country, and the conduct of ministers and 10 Downing Street. And I just wonder if actually some of this behaviour, and in the end, comes out of this sort of we become defensive of ourselves. We want to get things back for ourselves. We're looking for value in the wrong places, and actually, if we understood our value, we are in a place where we're much more able to be with one another, rather than doing to each other and seeing each other as commodities. And I think it's been really fascinating. I think the way that last week's readings blend into this week's readings, and I think sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. But I was really struck by how much that is happening this week, and how in the first letter of the Corinthians, we go from all that the body of Christ and the body metaphor has to tell us about not competing with one another, but valuing one another, to what it means to be loving. And of course, we hear the 1 Corinthians 13 passage so often, unfortunately, disengaged from the body metaphor. We spend a lot of time thinking about what it says to us about love, but of course, I think for Paul, that's the wrong way to look at it. Paul is speaking about, of course, how we build community, how we build a Christian community, but I'd argue also how the Christian community gives us a model for community, which is not based on me and my, but on ours, and what my conduct and my behaviour, how that affects the greater whole. One of the things I got for Christmas was a great book, a translation of you might have come across this, here it is, the First Nations version of the New Testament. So it's a translation of the New Testament by the indigenous people of the Turtle Islands, which of course North America. And the transition between 1 Corinthians 12 and 1 Corinthians 13 in there is really helpful, I think. It reads there, "I want you to set your hearts on the chief gifts, the ones that will bring the greatest blessing to the sacred family." And I think that those who've translated this version of the New Testament talk really movingly at the beginning of the translation about how these words might affect those who've suffered dominance and those who've had the church or colonialism's taken things from them, because we haven't been able to see humanity as a whole. We haven't been able to understand one another as a gift. We've seen each other as, even in the life of the church, especially in the missionary work of the church, we've seen one another as almost commodity, and we need to get back to gift and dwelling together, and all of that other stuff. In 1 Corinthians, it's just not about being a body, but that we're members of one another, and that love is the pinnacle of all that. And so I'm really struck by how, and I guess it's some of the Sam Wells stuff that actually, it seems to me that this week's texts are encouraging us to understand how we work out our faith and therefore our life by being with one another, not doing to, or even just being alongside. It's the being with and one of one another, which I think it's part of what the gospel tells us about how we avoid this disintegration, which allows for the behaviour which is self-seeking, which allows for power to become something which gets greater and greater in some forums and not in others, and corruption creeps in when we begin to not recognise how we're connected to one another.
Yeah. No, I think fascinating, Peter, the way you try to knit about value, worth, and then being together as a community. And I really like the way you put it, like how I, me, and mine have been such a slippery ground for all of us, where we tend to slip away. But what Paul is inviting us is to be with one another. So, I mean, if I may have to coin a word, I'm just thinking witness as witness. We need to be with people together and celebrating that. And as you also said, love is the pinnacle for all of this. So, but I mean, unfortunately, love today is again such a tricky word. People tend to use it for all sorts of things, which is good. We thank God for people for this gift of love. But particularly in this context of politics in the pulpit, what do you think are some take home for us to understand the political love or the politicalness of love in the context of church, community, and the nation today?
Yes, I mean, I think it's, as you say, love has become like a. Well, a colleague of mine says this about community, and I think we probably sometimes use community the same way we sometimes use love, as a sort of spray in word. When we don't know what to do, we just give a
Yeah.
scoosh of love, scoosh of community, and we think we've solved it all. But I guess um, love in the gospel context is something which is thoroughgoing and it's
Hmm.
hard, isn't it? And I guess in the sense that um, it's almost that sense that again in all of those in all of our scriptures this week, that love is prophetic, you know,
Hmm.
and the sense that um, love never leaves us where we are,
Yeah.
and I think that's the political edge of love, that with kindness and care and value being added, all those things about love which we all agree on.
Hmm.
There's also this other side, that love is also challenging, and that love, that we we can't disentangle love from truth.
Yes.
And I think that's where the court of justice comes. That actually, um, we can be too, frankly, we can be too good at love that's nice and kind and caring.
Yeah.
And what we see in our scriptures this week is that when love is true, and also speaks challenge and discomfort into a situation,
Yeah.
people don't want love anymore. People want, I think that there in Jeremiah and there in this week's gospel with Jesus, Jesus, it seems to me, Jesus is really saying is that when we are able uh, to be with one another so fully, prophecy won't come from outside.
Hmm.
Prophecy will come from
Yeah.
within. We won't see the prophetic voice as the thing we want to distance. The prophetic, um, the call and the challenge and justice will be a part of the whole from within the community. And that really, if we want to find true love, we have to form communities that allow us to do that, and we have to be. And I think until we get there, we have to find the courage, as Jeremiah did, as Jesus had no choice but uh, to be the outside voice, and to see that as an
Yeah.
act of love.
Hmm. I mean, profound, Peter, because the way you bring in love, community, prophetic nature, justice, I think that defines how love should be for us in our times. And as you can see, where Jesus in the Luke's gospel, after being at the synagogue in Nazareth and then reading the scriptures, now he tries to speak to them, that community, and the way he picks up the two examples in Luke chapter 4, verses 21 to 31 is the widow of Zarephath and Elijah, and then Naaman the Syrian. So the way he was talking in a Jewish context of speaking people who are outsiders for them, and both of them, and in a way trying to say love is all about inclusion. I mean, the way he was trying to challenge them as he read the scriptures, and that was the reason people did not like that kind of preaching, that kind of politics in the pulpit that Jesus did,
Yeah.
and they even tried to push him off the cliff.
Yeah. Because they want, again, it's almost like a commodifying the savior, isn't it? The Messiah, that we want him for, that we want this, even if we don't really want this version, but we want it for us.
Yeah.
And that temptation there is, I think, in all of us, and frankly, the temptation sometimes in our churches and church communities, that there should be no frontier, should there? There should be no extreme where people do not feel that they are a part of it. And I think we see that. I feel really privileged to be a part of a community here where just because of the place God gives us in Newcastle Cathedral and the people God gives us, day by day, we are frankly, we'd like to say we're welcoming, but day by day we're still challenged by different people who are one with us, but who come to us and bring something that we could consider a problem, but we ought not. That the people who come, are God's gift to us, all people, and hopefully us to them. And I think that, as you say, in Luke chapter 4, what we have is, that wonderful announcement of Jesus' ministry, and immediately wanting to create a frontier in group, a place where it will be and a place where it won't. And Luke's masterful way of moving this much earlier than Matthew and Mark, and this is it's a long contrived challenge and conflict for the others, isn't it? Whereas Luke's just saying, well, this is let's be honest, this is the way people are going to want to do. This is the way people are going to want to use the gospel, and we ought not to be like that.
Yeah. I think which is very important, because Jesus is saying it is not about passive love, but as you said, it is about prophetic love, where it is about truth, it is about inclusion, it is about community. And after reading Isaiah's scripture, Jesus is saying, giving them two examples of Elijah and Elisha, two great prophets, but again, not of their other ministries, but particularly with Naaman the Syrian and the widow, who were considered to be on the margins and outsiders, and trying to say a prophetic love for our times today is all about inclusion, celebrating because gospel is coming from the outsiders.
Yeah.
And do we have some openness to receive, to listen, and to see that we all celebrate together our own individual identities and celebrate that diversity, is what I see as part of this prophetic love that Jesus was preaching at that synagogue in Nazareth.
Absolutely right. I think that's exactly it.
I mean, and then moving on to Jeremiah, again, a prophet who begins his call, his ministry, and the way he recollects his call was something fascinating, where he said that God has called him as a boy or a child, and then God has already preordained him before even he thought of. And that's how God calls us into faith. It is not because because of what we are, but faith is a gift of God, and God calls us in God's own ways, in God's own times. And that's how we see from Jeremiah's, again, that prophetic love, that he recollects and reflects on his own call.
And that rootedness, I think, two things I was really struck by reading the Jeremiah passage over the last week again was that, there's the sense for the prophet and the prophetic, and those of us when we're in difficult circumstances, that that profound sense of being rooted in God and God and what God is doing through us and because of us. But more than that, that's that beautiful sense there is in these verses of our very life, and like you say, everything we're doing coming from the heart of God, but actually the whole of our lives being about trying to stay close to the heart of God, that the whole community is able to be close to the heart of God, that we're all feeling the heartbeat. But actually, what we've done is that we've created rings, concentric circles out from the heart of God that we've pushed people into, when actually we're all being called to help one another stay close to that sense of who God made us to be.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, it is fascinating to see how when Jeremiah was called, in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 10, it is written that God has called him to pluck up and pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. And there is so much of that prophetic love. So how do you understand this call for Jeremiah to pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant?
Yeah, I think that if I'm really honest, I think it's always a challenge. It's a challenging verse. I think, in the sense that that sense of which more of it's destructive than it is constructive, isn't it? And I think that's the. But I think the way it ends about building and planting is
Yeah,
is the key to it, and that's not just trying to be all sort of soft and liberal about it, but you can't have one without the other. And I think sometimes there is a readiness to pluck and pull down, like I say, in the sense that we can sometimes do that, not in a true or just or God-given manner, that we're just being destructive, but the destructive always has to be held together with the constructive, and the challenge always has to be joined with the more hopeful element, and I think this is part of what it means to be with one another, that actually we've got to be, like I said, the prophetic has to do those things which are challenging, and plucking and pulling and destroying and overthrowing, but that can't ever be where we leave it. And I
no,
think, and if we look around, all of the stories that come out from the places where actually, frankly, we have intervened. For instance, our nation has intervened in the lives of others. We've done a lot of plucking and pulling and destroying and overthrowing, and
yeah,
not enough of the building and the planting. And we look at what's happening, say, today in Afghanistan, and we we will have different opinions about where all that began. But I would think that the challenge now is, what about the building and the planting,
yeah, yeah,
where things have changed and we've been part of the catalyst for change. It's that, I think, part of the challenge also in those verses of Jeremiah is that prophetic love and politics in action from the pulpit is it's a long game. It's a long haul. We can't just get in and get out of it
no,
quickly. That we have to. It's about commitment and faithfulness as much as it is about And I think sometimes I worry that those who think they're particularly good at the prophetic, it can be a big flash, and it can be big
yeah,
big lights, and I'm doing this, but
yeah,
actually then what's happening next? And there's often a whole load of other people around who are left picking up the pieces. But
yeah.
I think the challenge here is that we are never called to do the harder stuff without doing also the picking up of the pieces.
No, yeah, I mean, indeed, Peter. I think you have summarized it so well. For we need to hold what you call politics, pulpit, practice, and action hand in hand. Otherwise, we can't take anything in isolation. And
Yeah,
I also like the way you put deconstruction and construction together. I mean, most times, if you think prophetic is only about deconstruction, but Jeremiah's call invites us, it is also about reconstruction. So I think we need to take all these six phrases together, in a sense, to pluck up, to pull down, to destroy, to overthrow, and mainly to build and to plant.
yeah,
And without that building and planting, I think prophetic nature is partial. So I think the call, what we see from Jeremiah's text, is for us to hold this paradox together, the deconstruction, construction, and reconstruction, and how we can make a difference in our world. And that nicely takes us to the psalm for this week, which is from Psalm 71, where again, prophet is trying to say, "Oh Lord, you are my rock of refuge. a strong fortress to save. I mean, we have heard these words several times of how God is our refuge. So, in the context of again the crisis for people who are branded as refugees, asylum seekers, again this nationality bills coming up and equalities bill coming up, how do we translate God as our refuge for our times today, Peter?
Yes, I mean, I've been really struck very recently that we hear, again, what you were saying about trying to, God speaks to us in our context about the things that are also happening in a wider context. It always seems to me, and we here at the cathedral in Newcastle are welcoming a much greater number of refugees all of a sudden, and it's interesting when you say how do we make. I think it's about making God as a refuge real is actually our call. There is the stuff that we can write about how we challenge a sort of harsh and not loving response.
Hmm.
That there is stuff about welcome and hospitality, but I think the question is almost about how are we, as the body of Christ in the world today, becoming a refuge for
Hmm.
those who don't know where to look, and I think again it's that making sure that we're preaching the message, but then we're also doing something with those who are in those circumstances. And I think for us, actually, part of and this is a tiny thing, and I should say that in our context here, there's many more churches in and around Newcastle doing much more than we are. But in terms of what we're doing with those who have chosen to come and be a part of this place, it has been so much around actually relationships and how gathering together after different times of the week, and finding a way that actually we can share we didn't have a way of sharing a meal until recently, and now we're trying to find ways to share a meal on a Sunday. So it's not just coming along and then having to walk miles back to their hotel, on the £8 a week that those who are fortunate to get that, and many aren't. So I think the stuff I was struck by today's or this week's psalm was actually, as we know that God is a refuge, how do we enable other people to know
Yeah.
that God is a refuge? And the answer is, it seems to me, that we become the refuge.
Hmm. I mean, profound again. Thank you very much, Peter. I think that you have summarized it so well. If God is our refuge, those of us who believe God is our refuge, the call is that you and I are called to be a refuge,
Yeah.
and our spaces are called to be refuge. And if we can be and become like that, I'm sure we are truthful to our call and are following Jesus Christ relevantly for our time. So thank you very much, Peter, for these conversations. I think to summarize what you have said, you've said it really clear and loud about prophetic love, about how we present our witness in a community, and how we practice our politics in the pulpit, and also about planting, how we plant in terms of that construction, providing an alternative as a church, as faithful followers. I think this is profound, and thank you very much, Peter, for giving us such an interesting conversation and joining us this week with your wisdom and with your knowledge and experience. So, all God's blessings, Peter, in your ministry there at Newcastle, and we look forward to hear more stories about the radical welcome as you minister in your context there in Newcastle. So, uh, and thanks to the rest of us who are joining us as listeners every week, and we are encouraged by all your comments. If you have enjoyed this episode of Politics in the Pulpit, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast, and share this episode with your friends. We know that our listeners are a passionate and knowledgeable crowd, and we would love to build a community of mutual learning and encouragement around the podcast. So, this series, we are asking for your questions ahead of each episode and to hear your thoughts afterwards. And the best place to join the conversation is on Twitter at pulpit underscore politics, or using the hashtag politics in the pulpit, or on our Facebook community, which you can access through the Joint Public Issues team's Facebook page and their website, jointpublicissues.org.uk. So each week I want to end with a question, and this week we are asking my question for all of us to think for us during this week, as we have heard from Peter about the prophetic love, and from the reading from Jeremiah, from Paul's letter to Corinthians, from Luke, and from Psalm 71. My question for all our listeners this week is: what does the call of Jeremiah to pluck up, to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant with love, with prophetic love, means for us today? Allow me to repeat the question again. What does the call of Jeremiah to pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant with love, with prophetic love, means for each of us in our faith and in our following Jesus today, in our public spheres today? So I'm sure each of us will engage with that question, and all of us will make politics in pulpit more interactive space where we can engage, converse, learn together, and grow together, and celebrate the faith that we have in Jesus Christ. So let's go into the world, both our politics and our pulpits, with a blessing. Uh, and the blessing for this week is: may each of us be anointed by God to know that God has called us. God is the one who has given us faith to go into the world to deconstruct, construct, and reconstruct, so that we can together make the kingdom of God a reality and possibility in our own localities. God's blessings to all of us. Amen.